Okay, so I accidentally hit my keyboard and I stopped my video. So I decided instead of starting that part four all over again, I would just take that little 6 minutes segment there and make that part four and just continue here. So here we are in now what is now part five of Herbert Spencer. So where did we leave off? Well, we left off with Herbert Spencer saying, when he's talking about the specialization of function, he's talking about structural differentiation and all that stuff. That you know, uh, once the parts become different from each other, once the parts in a system become different from each other, they also become interdependent. They become integrated into a single system. And he also said that as we have this specialization of function of parts, the actions of one part which fails in its function cannot be assumed by the other parts. Remember that. So that's where he's talking about interdependence and how interdependence creates, interdependence and specialization and complexity makes that system vulnerable to breakdown, and that creates the need for that system to have some kind of a develop some kind of a specialized regulating system. And for Spencer, that was going to be the state, right? Or maybe he would think about it as government, as a structure devoted, specialized to the function of internal regulation and social control. Okay, now where are we going to go next? Well, it's going to be here. All right. Just want to begin to make some summary points and before we move on to some new things. Okay, so what are some summary points? Well, we got Spencer talking about the organic analogy. That's what we've been doing a lot of lately, right? Spencer talking about the organic analogy. Spencer talking about growth. Spencer talking about structure. Spencer talking about differentiation. Spencer talking about structural differentiation. Okay, so we're going to start with this idea. Number one, right, that organic and social aggregates, both organic and social aggregates, so it doesn't matter whether we're talking about a natural system or a social system, they are characterized by progressive increases in size, right? Societies grow. And as we already said, they grow because of simple multiplication, or they grow because of combination, but in any case, they grow. And as they grow, that means an increase in the complexity of structure, right? As societies grow, they must become increasingly complex in their structure. Hang on to that idea for a little bit later on. As societies grow and they become more complex, their parts also become specialized, and that leads to interdependence, and that leads to integration of structures, right? So integration is accompanied by the progressive differentiation of structures and functions. Okay, everybody got that? Specialization creates interdependence, and the more specialization you have, the higher degree of specialization you have, the greater the level of interdependence of the individual parts. Puh. All right. Where am I here? Number three, right? Like organic aggregates, social aggregates grow. Here you go. Social aggregates grow from relatively undifferentiated states, conditions of incoherence, right? Relatively undifferentiated states, homogeny, right? Homogeneous states, okay, in which the parts resemble each other or are identical to each other. Think about that zygote and how all the cells all resemble each other. They're all basically the same, right? So social systems, like any natural system, grow from this relatively undifferentiated state in which the parts resemble each other to differentiated states, heterogeneity, right, in which the parts become more and more dissimilar. The parts become more and more dissimilar in both their structure, right, what they look like, right, their structure, and they become different. They become more and more dissimilar in terms of their function. Okay. Next point, number 4. The differentiation of parts implies growing interdependence. The more, it sounds weird, but the more different they become, the more interdependent they become. Okay. And with growing interdependence, you get growing integration. Okay. So that brings us to the notion of the specialization of functions, right? That brings us to the notion of the specialization of functions. Increasing complexity produces increasing specialization of functions. Okay, number 6. Here's a quote from Spencer. The consensus of functions, he says, becomes closer as evolution advances. The consensus of functions becomes closer as evolution advances. The complementarity of functions, right, becomes closer as evolution advances, so that, he continues, right, here's Spencer talking, the actions of one part, which, as we said, right, the actions of one part which fails in its function cannot be assumed by the other parts. Increasing mutual dependence. What this means, right, what that means is that increasing mutual dependence of unlike parts necessitates coordination and therefore the rise of a central or internal regulating system. Okay, that's it. So those are the main points of Herbert Spencer's organic analogy as well as his theory of social evolution. Now, what we finish with is the way that Herbert Spencer is going to classify societies, right? He has a couple of different ways of classifying different types of society, okay? So one way is he talks about the difference between what he calls militant, right? Militant and industrial societies. That's one way. Now we'll talk about those a little bit later on. I want to talk about militant and industrial societies later on. That's one way that he classifies societies. Now, he also classifies societies in terms of their evolutionary stage of development, right? Remember, he's saying, just like every functionalist, he's saying societies evolve from simple to complex forms, and they evolve in the direction of social progress. But now he's going to classify types of society in terms of their evolutionary stage. And here's the language, okay? Don't get hung up on the language, but here's the way he puts it, all right? He starts with the an early stage of social development, that stage of homogeneity, that stage that lacks specialization, right? He calls it simple. So he talks about simple societies, right? Simple societies evolve into what he calls compound societies. Compound societies evolve into what he calls doubly compound societies, right? And then doubly compound societies evolve into what he calls trebly compound. That's a weird way of talking, but he meant triple compound. Okay, so simple, the stages are simple, compound, doubly compound, and trebly compound, right? Now, telling you not to get hung up on that language, okay? Because all he's talking about, right? All he's talking about is classification of societies according to their degree of structural complexity, Okay, a compound society is more complex than a simple society. A doubly compound society is more complex than a compound society, and so on. He's just classifying these societies according to their degree of complexity, okay? Structural complexity, all right? Now, remember, one of the things we said not too long ago, I can't remember when I said it, right? But one of the things we said not too long ago was that complexity involves, or complexity implies regulation. The more complex a society is, the more it needs a specialized structure devoted to the function of internal regulation and social control, right? Remember that thing, right? So complexity implies regulation, all right? Simple societies don't have a big need for that, all right? So that means he could classify societies as simple, right? And that meant they were, oh, here's a fancy word for you. That meant they were acephalous. They were headless, in other words. They didn't have any formal system of leadership, you know. And if you think about like a hunting and gathering society, that's how it works. There is no formal system of leadership. Leadership is more or less casual, okay? If you're in a hunting and gathering society and you're a good hunter, people are going to turn to you for leadership in hunting. But that doesn't give you leadership over anything else, right? So his leadership is casual. That's what we mean. There's nothing that we could call like government or anything like that. Okay. Then you move on to a compound society. It's a little bit more complex, and he says this is a society that has occasional leadership, right? It becomes a little more structured, but again, nothing permanent, right? Nothing permanent. Occasional leadership. He talks about unstable headship, right? That would be the doubly compound society, right? Unstable headship. Maybe like monarchy, right? Where you have a monarch who is the leader, and it's all about their, their personality, right? And once they die or once they go away, you could get somebody else in who's going to do things completely different, right? Then you get like a trebly compound society, and those societies have stable leadership, right? So our society would be more like what Spencer described as a trebly compound society with stable leadership. In other words, we have formal government, right, encoded into law. So there's there's a system there in place, and individuals come and go, right? But the system the system of leadership remains intact. Okay, so compound and doubly compound societies and trebly compound societies he's describing in terms of the complexity of their political organizations. Trebly compound societies have the most complex style, or complex type of political organization. For example, in the form of actual formalized government. Okay. So, one of the ways he classifies society is according to level of complexity. So that's where he's using this language of simple, compound, doubly compound, trebly compound. Another way that he classifies societies is according to mode of settlement, right? So one way is according to some kind of mode of internal regulation, and the other way is according to the mode of settlement. So he makes a distinction between nomadic and semi-nomadic and semi-settled societies. All right, so that's just another way that he classifies social evolution. And all of those ways, right, or both of those ways, are ways of classifying societies. Now, he also proposes a classification of societies according to their type of internal regulation. Okay, so not just that they have internal regulation, but according to their type of internal regulation. So this is where he's talking about militant and industrial societies. All right. So this way of classifying societies is based on the character of relations between societies with each other within a social environment. So it's more or less how it's more or less talking about the environment that one society exists in is defined by its relationships with neighboring societies, and so the type of internal regulation that it's going to adopt or adapt would be a function of the nature of its relationships with other societies. So, in doing that, he distinguishes between what he calls militant, right? Militant and industrial societies. Now, those words are maybe a little bit confusing. I think maybe the word industrial there is a little bit confusing because it doesn't really have to do with whether or not a society, went through an industrial revolution. I think a better word, that what Spencer really meant by industrial would be more like industrious, right? An industrious society. Okay. Militant versus industrious. Okay. Now, here we go. So militant versus industrial societies, which I want you to kind of think about as industrious societies. Okay. And maybe one way to think about militant and industrious societies would be, warlike, militant, warlike, oriented toward war, and industrious, oriented toward productivity, right? Maybe an example of what Spencer would think of as a militant society in the world today would be something like North Korea. Maybe they're a militant society, and maybe an example of an industrial society, or what I'm calling an industrious society, would be maybe the way that we think about, for example, Japan. Okay. North Korea oriented toward war and internal control, and Japan oriented toward producing flat screen televisions or something, right? Technology, okay? When you have peaceful relations, right? When a society has peaceful relations with its neighbors, that means you could have relatively weak and diffuse systems of internal regulation. With militant relations, right? With militant relations comes more coercion and more centralized control. In the internal structure then of a society becomes dependent on the presence or absence of conflict with neighboring societies. Hold on, I'm gonna pause this here for a second. All right, so I hope you get that basic difference between militant and industrial societies, the way he's talking about it. Again, in terms of internal regulation now, because that's really what we're describing, are styles of internal regulation, is the characteristic trait of a militant society is compulsion, right? Where the individual will is overruled by government, okay? Here's what Spencer wrote about militant societies. He said, the cooperation by which the life of the militant society is compulsory the cooperation uh, by which the life of the militant society is lived is compulsory cooperation. Militant societies are based on compulsory, or in other words, forced cooperation. Then he says the characteristic trait of industrial society is voluntary cooperation. Militant society, compulsory cooperation. Industrial society, voluntary cooperation. So Spencer stressed that the degree of societal complexity now is independent of the militant industrial dichotomy that we have here, right? So they're not stages of evolution. They are adaptations to the environment that that society is in relationship to its neighbors. So, in other words, relatively undifferentiated societies could be industrial in that sense, because what determines whether a society is militant or industrial is not the level of complexity, but the presence or absence of conflict with the outside. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. So now, I use Japan as an example. That would be something like closer to what Spencer may think of as as an industrial society. And I use North Korea as an example of something. If Spencer were around today, he may think about that as a militant society. And now maybe we can think of like militant and industrial on two ends of a continuum, so that no society is probably purely militant or purely industrial, but has some blending of the characteristics of both that's going to push it toward one end or the other. So if we think about the United States as a relatively industrial society, right, or a relatively industrious society, we would also recognize that it has certain characteristics of its internal organization that resemble militancy, the way that Spencer talked about it. So let's continue just summarizing what he meant by militant and industrial society. We know the basic difference between them, right? So the basic difference between militant and industrial is that militant societies are based on compulsory cooperation, and that industrial societies are based on voluntary cooperation. Okay, so following from that, what else do we get? Well, what Spencer did was identify a dominant function or activity, right, and then describe that dominant function or activity within militant and industrial societies. So here you go, right? So a militant society is based on, in its internal organization and internal coordination, right, and social control and so forth. The militant society is based on corporate defense, right? Corporate defense and offense, right? Corporate defense and offense, right? For preservation and for aggrandizement. Preparation for war, in other words, right? Preparation to fight a defensive war and preparation to fight an offensive war, to aggrandize ourselves. So, this brings up a good point, right, that I'll get to in just a minute, because let me get the other one here. The dominant function or activity of industrial society is peaceful, mutual rendering of individual services. Okay, peaceful, mutual rendering of individual services. So not only can we think of militant and industrial as two ends of a continuum, and that no society is a perfect blend of both, but that a single society can move, right, back and forth, right, between militancy and industriousness, right? So if we were to look at, if we were to look at the nation of Japan in the 1930s, maybe we would say, well, boy, Japan was a really militant society. It was expansionist and it was fighting wars of conquest all over Asia. Okay. And then coming out of World War II, it became much more industrial or much more industrious, right? Even to the extent of getting rid of its military and only establishing a purely relatively small scale self defense uh, uh, armed forces, right? Okay, everybody get that, right? Okay, so what else? The difference between the two in terms of their principle of coordination, right? So, what's the difference between militant society and industrial society in terms of their principle of social coordination? Militant society is based on, like we said, compulsory coordination with regimentation by enforcement of orders. Okay, enforcement of orders, regimentation and enforcement of orders. Industrial society, its principle of social coordination is, we said, voluntary cooperation, right? Voluntary cooperation by contract and by principles of justice. Okay. What else do we have here? The relationship between the state and the individual. We look at militant society and industrial society. What's the difference in terms of relations between the state and the individual? In a militant society, individuals exist for the benefit of the state. Okay? Individuals exist for the benefit of the state. And so the state, and again, think of North Korea, right? The state imposes strict limitations, strict constraints, right, on individual liberty. Okay. Industrial society. What about the relationship between individuals and the state in an industrial society? The state exists for the benefit of individuals, not the other way around. The state exists for the benefit of individuals, and there are very few restraints on property and on mobility. People are free to come and go. People are free to own property and so on. Okay. What else? What about the structure of the state? What does the structure of the state look like in a militant society? It is highly centralized, right? Highly centralized. In an industrial society, the structure of the state is highly decentralized. Okay. What about social stratification, the structure of social stratification in both? In a militant society, you have very strict ranking, right? Very strict ranking and even inheritance of position. And in an industrial society, you have openness of rank and you have social mobility. So where you start in society is not necessarily where you end up. Okay, because they allow industrial societies allow for social mobility. Okay, what about the type of economic activity that defines both? All right, militant society, very little external trade, right? Very little external trade, very strong protectionism, right? And self-sufficiency. When I read that, I think of Stalinism, right? Basically, that you could describe Stalinism that way. Okay, country was very closed off. There was very little external trade, not necessarily because of their own choosing, but because after, and again, has something to do with the relationship of the society to other societies, right? After the Russian Revolution and the establishment of the Soviet Union, capitalist countries wanted to isolate Russia, or they wanted to isolate the Soviet Union. They didn't want to trade with the Soviet Union. So it had to become self-sufficient, right? And even Stalin talked about, industrialization at any cost. And what he was talking about was how the Soviet Union would have to become industrially self-sufficient because it couldn't rely on trade, right, with its neighbors, etc. What about an industrial society? What about its type of economic activity? Well, Spencer says there is economic autonomy, right? A lot of economic autonomy, interdependence, and free and peaceful trade. Okay. All right. And then finally, what's the difference between, I'm going to call them valued social and personal characteristics? What kind of person does a militant society desire? And what kind of person does an industrial society desire? So a militant society wants patriots. In fact, I'm even going to change that, right? Not so much patriotism, but um, narrow nationalism, right? In other words, uh, unquestioning loyalty, right, to the state. They also desire courage, reverence to its leaders, or reverence of its leader. Again, think about, oh man, think about North Korea and think about the sort of cult of personality, right, in North Korea. Okay, around Kim Jong Un, right? That their people are to have unquestioned faith in authority and a high level of discipline. Okay. And then what about the valued social and personal characteristics in an industrial society? So that would be independence, right? We value independence. We there's a value placed on respect for others, resistance to coercion, individual initiative and individualism, right? And Spencer would say also truthfulness and kindness toward others. So there you go. That's the end, right? We talked all about Herbert Spencer and his functionalism, and the idea that we're calling him a social Darwinist because he's talking about social evolution the same way that we would talk about the evolution of an organism. He's bringing some of that Darwinian lingo, right, to his discussion of social evolution. We got the organic analogy, structural differentiation, all that stuff, and then we just finished with the way that Herbert Spencer classified society. All right, and so that's it, y'all. That's it for now. So the next time I give you some lecture material, it's going to be on Karl Marx. All right. Oh man, and that's going to be a contrast because here you have Herbert Spencer, this staunch defender of laissez-faire capitalism, and then you're going to have Karl Marx, the radical socialist revolutionary, okay, who's seeking the abolition, the overthrow of the capitalist system. And I always thought, and it's I think fitting some way that in London there's a place called Highgate Cemetery where Karl Marx and Herbert Spencer are buried. And Herbert Spencer's grave is located just across from Karl Marx's grave in sight of each other. And I think about, sometimes I think about what must go on, between those two graves after midnight in Highgate Cemetery. What kind of debates, what kind of arguments, maybe even what kind of fistfights break out between those two. Anyway, okay. Stay cool, y'all, and but wash your hands. Okay? Good night, y'all.